The shutters of the East Bay mansion rattled against the December wind, though no hand reached to secure them. Some houses groan with age, others, like the Beaufort residence, seemed to breathe, exhaling sorrow with every draught, and within its walls the first fracture in a dynasty appeared, so faint that few alive then recognized it for what it truly was. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The Beaufort family of Charleston had long cultivated a reputation that mixed old mercantile wealth with a more recent acquisition of political influence. To the casual observer, their position appeared unassailable: a grand house overlooking the harbor, kinship ties to prominent rice planters upriver, and a lineage carefully burnished through portraits, donations, and polite appearances at church. Beneath the surface, however, their name was whispered in association with matters less savory: debts that vanished under suspicious circumstances, property deeds that shifted hands after untimely deaths, and illnesses that seemed to stalk neighboring households with unnerving selectivity. It was in the winter of 1834 that the first surviving record of true discord within the family emerged. Though the surviving fragments are uneven, letters half preserved by humidity, scraps of testimony gathered decades later, a few legal instruments whose ink has not wholly faded, the impression they create is of a household already divided between appearances and hidden woe. At the center stood Silas Beaufort, patriarch, whose stern features still gaze from a surviving portrait now housed in the county archives. He had mastered the delicate balance of Charleston society, outwardly a man of piety and principle, inwardly calculating, proud, and unwilling to permit interference in the family's ascent. His wife, Margaret Beaufort, though of frailer constitution, was possessed of a sharper intelligence than most granted her, and it was she whose letters first hinted at the unease. In a surviving scrap addressed to her sister in Savannah, Margaret wrote in a hand that trembles near the signature, "What appears settled here is anything but. Our meals grow quiet, our children are divided in their sympathies, and I sometimes wonder if the very air in these rooms is poisoned by secrecy." Charles watches his father as if he were both rival and disciple. Victoria masks her unease in piety, and Eleanor, poor Eleanor, knows nothing but obedience, though she bears the greatest weight of us all. This reference to Eleanor, the youngest, then barely 12, would in time become the key to understanding the full horror of the Beaufort story. But in 1834 her name passes through the record almost incidentally, a child seen but not yet fully understood. The Beaufort household, though grand, was not immune to whisper. Neighbors recalled late-night arrivals by physicians whose visits were not explained, and wagons unloading crates at odd hours into the cellar. One domestic servant, later deposed in a minor inheritance dispute, recalled a smell of medicine, or worse, like copper and vinegar, seeping upward through the boards of the great hall. The mansion had been altered internally by Silas to contain a private chamber that he termed his study, though others suspected it housed more than books. Financially, 1834 proved advantageous to the Beauforts. Two rival merchants died of sudden fever, leaving properties that through a sequence of opaque legal transactions fell into Beaufort possession. Yet the pattern was sufficiently irregular that even at the time, murmurs of impropriety spread. A diary entry from Judge Alcott, preserved in a bound volume at the Historical Society, remarks, "There is no illness so swift as fortune favors the Beaufort. Charleston suffers losses, and the heirs are guided as if by invisible hand to East Bay Street." What Margaret saw from inside was different, the erosion not of fortune, but of soul. Her surviving journal entries, some carefully inked, others nearly illegible drafts, never meant for outside eyes, reveal an increasing despair. She describes Charles, the eldest son, as hardened too young, his speech curt, his manner often cruel when he thinks none observe. Victoria she characterizes as ever the image of filial virtue, but hollowed by fear. And of Silas she writes with mingled admiration and dread, "He is a man whose will bends even providence to his design. I fear what such force, left unchecked, may demand of those bound to him by blood." It was in this year, too, that a physician from Philadelphia was invited to Charleston under the pretense of consulting on Margaret's nervous ailments. Surviving correspondence suggests that the physician, Dr. Harriman, suspected more than he was told. In a letter to a colleague, he remarked cryptically, "The case is domestic rather than medical. I perceive a family arranged more like an institution, with roles assigned and rehearsed, than a household of affection." The youngest girl bears herself with the meekness of a novice, though no convent walls enclose her. He did not return the following season. What is striking in hindsight is the care with which the Beauforts managed appearance. Social gatherings at their home continued, Silas remained active in civic committees. Victoria was praised for her charitable efforts with the church society, yet woven beneath every public account are anomalies. A ledger from the rice market shows payments made to men later identified as enforcers in unrelated cases. A parish record notes Margaret absent from communion for months at a time, though no illness was publicly acknowledged. A carriage accident involving a distant cousin, whose land later augmented the Beaufort holdings, was dismissed as chance despite suspicions of tampering. By the end of 1834, Margaret's private writings grow more urgent. In one particularly chilling draft, later found folded into the lining of a trunk, she writes, "They do not see that the danger lies not without, but within these walls. The conspiracy is not of politics only, but of flesh, inheritance and blood. What Charles covets, his father directs. What Victoria conceals, Eleanor must bear. If I speak, I am silenced. If I remain silent, she becomes both daughter and wife in the eyes of this house. I tremble for her soul." This fragment, fragile and ink-blotted, remains perhaps the earliest clear articulation of what later generations would struggle to accept, that within the Beaufort household, roles were bent into grotesque forms, and innocence was not preserved, but repurposed to maintain the family's cohesion. The wider world in 1834 saw only the wealth and stability of Charleston's merchant class. Ships filled the harbor, slaves labored in rice fields, political speeches thundered in the assembly. But within the Beaufort mansion, beneath its carved cornices and mirrored parlors, a story had already begun that would in time unravel not only the family, but the very structures of trust in Charleston society. When later historians examined the Beaufort case, they often point to the winter of 1834 as the fulcrum. Before that year, the family's sins could be dismissed as rumor. After, the fragments multiply: letters, testimonies, ledgers, memories, each pointing toward a design more calculated and more sinister than ordinary corruption. And always at the center of these fragments appears the figure of young Eleanor, quiet, obedient, drawn into roles not of her choosing. The mansion itself would bear witness. Visitors in later decades described rooms that seemed to retain a heaviness, as if voices once raised there still clung to the plaster. The parlor, with its carved fireplace, became known not for music, but for arguments whispered to have ended in threat. The stairwell creaked not with age, but with the memory of steps made in haste, in secrecy, in fear. It was there, in that house, that the line between daughter and wife, heir and captive, would begin to blur. And from those blurred lines would emerge a scandal so vast it would stretch across states, implicate judges and sheriffs, and end on the gallows. But in 1834, none of that had yet come to pass. There was only a house that seemed to breathe, a family that concealed more than it revealed, and a child named Eleanor, who stood at the threshold of a fate both unimaginable and inescapable. The air in Charleston thickens with the heat of summer, pressing upon body and mind alike. In that season of fever and decay, the Beaufort name spread not by honor, but by quiet rumor, and from beneath their polished veneer emerged the first tangible evidence of a deeper conspiracy. In the year 1835, the first documents that would later incriminate the Beauforts began to surface, though only in fragments, never in whole. It is from these fragments, cross-referenced with later testimony, that historians can reconstruct the emerging fault lines within the family. What appeared at first glance to be the ordinary discontents of a wealthy Charleston household soon revealed itself as something far more deliberate, a system of manipulation in which human life and inheritance were currencies to be traded. The central discovery was a ledger, preserved almost by accident. It had been hidden among shipping records deposited at the courthouse following a routine audit of import duty. The ledger did not belong with those papers. It bore the hand of Charles Beaufort, then barely 18, but already entrusted with his father's affairs. In columns too neat to be mistaken for casual notes, the ledger contained entries that combined the language of commerce with that of mortality. Beside names of neighboring families appeared brief notations: illness, swift, resolved, to be managed, and chillingly secured through Eleanor. The meaning of these phrases was not immediately clear, yet later events would supply their grim interpretation. At the time, the ledger aroused little public notice. A clerk who handled it remarked on its oddity, but fearing reprisal, returned it to the file where it lay dormant for 2 decades, until federal investigators reopened the records. What is striking is that Margaret Beaufort herself may have known of the ledger's existence, for in her surviving letters, she hints at an account book where death and property are written in the same line. Margaret's awareness grew sharper in this year. Her journal entries speak of long consultations between Silas and Charles, where Victoria listens but never speaks, and of Eleanor being summoned to the study late in the evening, emerging pale and wordless. The mother's dread is palpable. She is not daughter now, but instrument. They mold her as one molds wax, and I, though her mother cannot shield her, my protestations are met with silence, and silence is heavier than any rebuke. Servants of the household, when questioned years later, supplied corroborating detail. One, identified only as Lydia, testified that the young Eleanor was compelled to serve in capacities beyond her years, arranging papers, memorizing phrases, even practicing signatures upon blank sheets. She was told, Lydia recalled, that her hand must match another's, and that if she faltered, the family would lose all. The girl's obedience, drilled through fear and isolation, was to become one of the most potent instruments of the Beaufort design. Charleston society in 1835 remained blind to these developments, seeing only the surfaces the Beauforts chose to reveal. They hosted gatherings marked by candlelit music, their parlor filled with guests admiring portraits and conversing in genteel tones. Yet within weeks of such gatherings, another property might shift unexpectedly into their possession, another rival struck by sudden affliction. The pattern was too consistent to be chance, yet too veiled to provoke open accusation. It was also in this year that the first fissures between Silas and Margaret reached visible expression. One account, preserved in the notes of Reverend Phelps, who ministered to the parish, records Margaret's sudden visit to his study, distraught and insistent that the sacrament must not bind where abomination resides. She did not elaborate, but the clergyman, troubled, remarked that she seemed haunted less by sin than by fear of what sin had been recast as virtue within her household. Charles meanwhile grew into the role his father prepared for him. Letters to business associates reveal his calculating tone, stripped of youthful hesitation. He spoke of transactions as conversions of fortune, and referred to neighboring families not as friends but as resources in wait. His correspondence with a cousin in Savannah includes a chilling line: one does not inherit, one acquires. Inheritance is merely acquisition performed within the veil of law. Victoria's role remained more ambiguous. Outwardly devout, she cultivated her reputation through charitable appearances, particularly with churchwomen's societies, yet within the family, she was complicit. Margaret's notes describe her daughter's skill at concealment. Victoria smiles, prays and brings food to the poor, yet when she returns she places upon Charles's desk papers she should not possess. She is the family's velvet glove, and her piety a mask more perfect than her father's sternness. Eleanor, now entering her 13th year, became the axis upon which the entire household seemed to turn. Margaret observed her daughter's growing silence with anguish. She no longer asks to play, nor reads aloud as once she did. She listens always, her eyes lowered, her lips repeating phrases not her own. She is fashioned into something neither child nor free, and in her I see the outline of my own captivity. The wider community, though largely ignorant, could not remain entirely untouched. One merchant's wife, Miss Whitcomb, recalled years later that she had seen Eleanor, at a gathering, seated beside her brother Charles in a posture more like consort than sister, though her eyes betrayed no will of her own. At the time such impressions were dismissed as exaggerations or idle gossip. Only later would they be recognized as early glimpses of a reality too monstrous to articulate. The theme of sickness recurs in every surviving record of 1835, whether genuine illness or induced. The effect was always the same: destabilization of households, whose holdings the Beauforts coveted. A physician named Dr. Fenwick recorded a striking cluster of deaths, fevers that spread not through neighborhoods but selectively, striking families with property adjacent to Beaufort lands. In his notes, preserved in a medical journal, he remarks, "It is as though contagion respects boundary lines, halting where the Beauforts hold sway, yet consuming where they desire expansion." By autumn of that year, Margaret's writings grow darker still. She confides to her journal that she has begun making copies of letters, hiding them within objects too humble to draw notice. In one passage she reveals, "I have placed among Eleanor's few toys a record of what I have seen, for though she is bound to silence now, one day she may recall that her mother did not wholly abandon truth." Such precautions suggest that Margaret recognized her life to be in peril should she speak too openly. The Beaufort mansion itself seemed to mirror the family's condition. Visitors described rooms heavy with stale air despite open windows, mirrors that reflected with a dull cast, staircases that groaned though sound construction should have prevented it. Servants whispered of a locked cellar, where crates of powders and tinctures were stored, and of nights when strange fumes seeped upward, leaving the household restless and pallid by morning. What emerges from all these fragments is the image of a family weaving secrecy into daily life,
turning deception into routine. Property was acquired through illness, wills adjusted through persuasion or forgery, and Eleanor molded into the instrument by which transitions could be sanctified. By the close of 1835, Margaret's health itself had begun to fail, whether through natural frailty, poisoning, or the slow toll of despair is uncertain, but her writings from December are almost prophetic. If I succumb, let none mistake it for weakness alone. The design is larger than one life, and it claims us all. Charles hardens into stone, Victoria smiles into falsehood, and Eleanor, she is the sacrifice upon which they build their permanence. If Providence does not intervene, she will be called daughter no longer but something far worse. Thus the year ended, with Charleston glittering in its holiday finery, unaware or unwilling to admit that one of its most prominent families had already begun the descent from respectability into infamy. For those who looked more closely, however, the signs were unmistakable: the ledger hidden among shipping papers, the altered roles within the household, the mother's whispered protests, and above all the transformation of Eleanor from child into cipher.
The Beaufort conspiracy had not yet been named, but its architecture was already visible to those willing to see, a design built upon sickness, secrecy, and the perversion of familial bonds. And as 1836 approached, the mansion on East Bay Street stood silent, its windows dark, holding within its walls the quiet preparation for a tragedy whose echoes would stretch far beyond Charleston, into courts, prisons, and the very annals of American justice. The year 1836 marked a season of confrontation within the Beaufort mansion. What had long been implied through silence now erupted into words and gestures of violence. From this year, the records breathe with urgency, as though those who wrote knew they were running out of time. The surviving letters of Margaret Beaufort from this year, preserved in fragments at the Historical Society, reveal the full strain of her resistance. Written in an unsteady hand, some ink blurred by what appear to be tears, they oscillate between pleas for divine intervention and coded hints of tangible evidence. One letter, unsent but folded within a devotional book, contains this desperate line: "They would make Eleanor both child and spouse, both blood and possession. The law of God is overturned within these walls, and I alone am witness, but witness without power is but silence in another form." It is from this line that the series takes its grim title, The Locked Study. In the spring of 1836, Silas and Charles are said to have withdrawn nightly into the locked study. Margaret, attempting to force entry, was repelled physically by her husband, a detail supplied not by her own pen, but by the testimony of a housemaid overhearing the scuffle. The maid recalled Margaret crying out, "You will not make her yours," followed by the slam of the study door and the sound of something heavy striking wood. Later inspection of the study, after the household fell into disarray, revealed peculiar objects: sealed vials of tinctures, a pair of small scalpels, and stacks of parchment covered with signatures in Eleanor's hand. These were practice sheets, the girl's script perfected until it became indistinguishable from Margaret's own. Such forgeries allowed Charles and Silas to manipulate wills, deeds, and letters without suspicion. Yet beyond the fraud, the deeper horror resided in Eleanor's role, not merely as scribe, but as future bride, the vessel by which bloodlines and property would remain bound within the family itself. Margaret's discovery. One pivotal entry in Margaret's journal recounts her discovery of a sealed packet beneath Charles's desk. Within it lay documents indicating that Eleanor had already been betrothed to Charles himself through a private contract, witnessed by Silas and endorsed with Victoria's mark. Though no magistrate had validated the document, its existence alone was enough to break Margaret's resolve. She describes her reaction in shattering prose. "My hand trembled so violently I thought the lamp would fall. I read her name joined to his, not in siblinghood but in union unholy, and I felt my breath depart. This is not merely sin but a crime carved into paper. If heaven does not strike them down, I must." Whether Margaret attempted to destroy or conceal these papers is uncertain. Some scholars argue that fragments of them appear among the Beaufort estate inventory decades later, partially burned. Others believe Margaret smuggled copies to her confessor, Reverend Phelps, though his records remain silent on the matter. Eleanor's silence. Testimony from servants during the later trials paints a chilling portrait of Eleanor in this year. Barely 14, she carried herself with the composure of an adult, yet her eyes betrayed a detachment as though the self had been hollowed. Lydia, the long-serving maid, remarked, "She never wept, never spoke unless spoken to." They had drilled silence into her, like one trains an animal. Only with her mother did her lips tremble, but even then no words would come. Margaret, writing of her daughter, laments, "I reach for her hand, and find it limp, as if the spirit has departed though the body yet breathes." She repeats phrases Charles teaches but none of her own. "I fear they have already taken her soul, and marriage will only claim the husk that remains. The act of violence. By midsummer, tension boiled into physical violence. One account, derived from court transcripts many years later, states that Silas struck Margaret during a confrontation in the dining room. The blow left a bruise visible to several visitors, though Margaret excused it as a fall. Privately, she recorded, "The mark upon my face is but the surface. The true wound is in the knowledge that my children aid him in this." Victoria prays at church, yet she holds the basin as he washes the blood from his hand, and Charles smiles. It was after this episode that Margaret attempted flight. Packing only a few possessions, she sought to remove Eleanor from the house under cover of darkness, but Charles intercepted them at the door, dragging his sister back while Silas confined Margaret to her chamber for 3 days without food. Lydia, the maid, risking punishment, smuggled water to her mistress. This failed escape attempt would haunt Margaret until her death, and its failure sealed Eleanor's fate within the household. The papers hidden away, yet Margaret did not cease her resistance. If she could not save her daughter outright, she resolved at least to leave behind evidence. She began copying key letters, embedding them within common objects, sewn into hems of clothing, slipped beneath the lining of furniture, concealed within the hollow of a candlestick. Decades later, when investigators searched the abandoned mansion, they discovered several such caches, testament to Margaret's desperate attempt to preserve truth. In one surviving letter she writes, "To whomever finds these words, know that Eleanor is not wife by will, nor child by innocence. She is fashioned into what serves their greed. If my hand no longer writes, take this as witness that I fought in silence, though I could not prevail." Charleston society turns. Rumors began to seep into Charleston society by late 18. Neighbors remarked upon the unusual closeness of Charles and Eleanor, their shared walks in the garden, his hand upon her shoulder too often, her gaze fixed to the ground. Whispers circulated at gatherings, but none dared accuse openly. The Beaufort wealth and influence acted as a shield, disarming those who might have spoken. Yet one figure, a physician named Dr. Fenwick, noted with unease the peculiar maladies afflicting families adjacent to Beaufort property. In his private journal he remarked, "The sicknesses strike with uncanny selectivity, and when I press the matter, young Beaufort smiles in a manner that chills the marrow. I cannot prove poison, yet the pattern is too exact." His suspicion, though unspoken publicly, would later serve as corroborating evidence. The breaking point. By autumn, Margaret's strength was faltering. Her writings grow more fragmented, as if exhaustion and despair broke her capacity for sustained thought. She records dreams in which Eleanor appears bound by invisible cords, her mouth sewn shut, her eyes pleading. She also notes shadows moving in the corridors at night, doors opening without sound, the study light burning until dawn. Whether these were hallucinations or real observations, the effect is the same. The household became a prison of perpetual dread. The breaking point came in November, when Margaret, in a rare act of open defiance, confronted Silas before the entire household. According to Lydia, she cried, "You will damn her soul for your fortune. Better she perish than be made your bride." The room fell into stunned silence, broken only by Charles's laughter. Silas struck her again, but this time Victoria interceded, not to protect her mother, but to shield her father, whispering that too much noise would bring inquiry. Margaret, bruised and broken, retreated. In her journal that night, she wrote her final clear entry, "I cannot stop that. I can only leave trace enough that others may. If Eleanor's silence endures, let these papers speak where she cannot. I pray they are found." Thus ended 1836 for the Beaufort household, with Margaret's resistance silenced, Eleanor more entangled than ever, and Charleston society circling with curiosity yet unwilling to pierce the veil. What had once been whispered within closed rooms, now left faint echoes in the street. The mansion itself became a symbol, a place where shutters closed early, where lamps burned at odd hours, where the sound of footsteps carried long after midnight. The conspiracy had grown too large to remain contained. In the years to come, its exposure would burst forth into trials and execution, but in 1836, it remained a house of whispered threats, its greatest victim still trapped within, a daughter and soon-to-be wife in name only. The year 1837 opened upon Charleston with the usual rhythm of commerce and society. Ships unloaded tobacco and rice upon the wharves, church bells rang, and parlors glittered with polite company. Yet within these polite rooms, whispers about the Beauforts swelled louder than hymns or music, whispers becoming words. For years rumors had clung to the family like faint smoke. By 1837, those rumors sharpened into words, circulated with uneasy candor. The Beaufort mansion, once a symbol of affluence, was now spoken of as a house where strange rites occurred, where illness followed invitations,
and where a daughter no longer seemed to belong to child. Several surviving letters from the Charleston elite, preserved in private collections, reflect this shift. A Mrs. Whitcomb writes to her cousin in Savannah, "I would not place my daughters in that house for any fortune." There Eleanor moves beside her brother, not as sister but as consort, and the mother has faded from view entirely. Some say she has taken to her bed, others that she has gone mad. The father smiles too often for a man of piety. Such language, though veiled, reveals the unease. Respectable society could no longer ignore the contradiction. The Beauforts still hosted gatherings, but fewer accepted invitations, and those who did noted the unsettling atmosphere. Eleanor seated beside Charles in the place of Margaret, Victoria, overseeing accounts rather than hymns, Silas watching with an expression of proprietary pride. The mother's disappearance. Margaret's presence all but vanished in this year. No letters survive after January of 1837, and her journal ends abruptly with a page left blank, as though interrupted mid-thought. Servants later testified that she confined herself to her chambers, seen only rarely at windows. Some believed she had been poisoned, others that despair itself consumed her. Lydia, the faithful maid, told investigators. Mistress was alive in the spring, but her eyes held no light. By summer she was gone, and none could say where her body lay. The absence of a funeral, burial record, or mourning announcement is among the most damning silences in the Beaufort archive. Margaret Beaufort, once the most vivid voice against her family's corruption, vanishes as if erased. The physician's suspicion. Meanwhile, Dr. Fenwick grew bolder in his private inquiries. He had tracked the unusual pattern of illnesses, striking families with property coveted by the Beauforts. In 1837 he recorded, "It is not fever that moves, but intention. This is contagion, guided by hand and purpose. The deaths do not spread outward, they fall upon those who stand in the family's path." Though he stopped short of publishing these suspicions, Fenwick began confiding in select colleagues. One such colleague, Dr. Halloway of Savannah, preserved his letters, later vital in shaping the case against the Beauforts. Fenwick understood that to accuse openly without evidence would be ruinous. Instead, he gathered records quietly, building the foundation of what would later become an indictment. The daughter as instrument. Eleanor, now 15, appeared publicly less as a child, and more as a wife in all but ceremony. Witnesses recall her pale composure, her silence, and the way Charles's hand rested upon hers as though sealing possession. Some described her as obedient to the point of lifelessness. Others sensed beneath her stillness a flicker of anguish. One chilling account, written by Reverend Phelps, describes a parish visit in which he found Eleanor reading aloud from scripture, her voice steady but mechanical. When he asked her what the passage meant, she paused and looked to Charles before answering. It was, the Reverend wrote, as though her conscience had been replaced with his command. Margaret's worst fears had come true. Her daughter was no longer daughter alone, but instrument of the family's unholy consolidation. Charleston's turning point. The turning point came in September of 1837, when the sudden death of a merchant, Mr. Allerton, stirred open suspicion. Allerton had dined at the Beaufort mansion the week prior, and his estate included lands adjoining theirs. His widow testified that he fell ill within hours of returning home, his symptoms violent and abrupt. Fenwick, called to the bedside, noted discoloration about the mouth and a bitterness in the throat, inconsistent with natural fever. He wrote in his notes, "Poison is not merely likely, but certain." The widow, desperate and unafraid, whispered publicly that her husband had been murdered for his land. Within weeks, other families began recounting similar suspicions. Relatives who had died following Beaufort invitations, properties that had changed hands with unsettling convenience. By winter the Beaufort name was no longer spoken with deference but with dread. In parlors, men leaned close and asked, "Who shall fall next?" while women warned their children not to accept gifts from Eleanor. Seeds of inquiry. Though no formal charges were yet filed, the groundwork of inquiry was laid. Reverend Phelps collected testimonies discreetly, noting inconsistencies in the family's accounts. Dr. Fenwick preserved his records with increasing care, aware that his own safety was in jeopardy. A circle of wary allies formed around the idea that the Beauforts must be stopped, yet the family remained outwardly unshaken. Silas attended church with the same stern dignity, Charles conducted business with apparent confidence, and Victoria continued her charitable facade. Eleanor appeared at each occasion, silent and pale, her presence both evidence and victim of the family's corruption. The mansion's aura. Descriptions of the Beaufort mansion in 1837 take on a Gothic intensity. Visitors remarked upon the heavy curtains drawn even by day, the lingering odors of strange tinctures, the locked cellar doors. One account claims that the walls themselves seemed to exhale a dampness, as if the house had absorbed the suffering within. The great mirrors of the parlor, once polished to brightness, were said to reflect dimly, giving distorted shapes rather than clear likenesses. To outsiders, the house had become less a home than a mausoleum in wait. The coming trials, though the trials would not commence until years later, 1837 stands as the year the tide turned irreversibly. The death of Allerton, the disappearance of Margaret, and the persistence of Dr. Fenwick's suspicions converged to make silence impossible. The Beauforts were not yet named publicly as murderers, but the shadow of accusation lengthened. By the year's end, Charleston society no longer sought their company, invitations went unanswered, partnerships quietly dissolved, and families once allied began distancing themselves. The Beauforts remained ensconced in their mansion, but isolation had begun its slow suffocation. Looking back, historians mark 1837 as the pivot point, the moment when the private horrors of the Beaufort family began to press against the public conscience of Charles. The whispers that had long circled finally thickened into words of accusation. Margaret was gone, Eleanor transformed, and the city at last began to glimpse the scale of corruption. The storm was gathering, and though years of secrecy had preserved the family, the collapse had already begun. The mansion, still standing in solemn grandeur, had become the stage for an approaching reckoning that no wealth could stave off.
Charleston entered the year 1838 under heavy skies. A humid winter pressed down upon the city, and a sense of unease hung in the air like the gathering of an unseen storm. For months, suspicions about the Beaufort family had multiplied. Now those whispers edged dangerously close to truth. The widow's persistence. Mrs. Allerton, still mourning her husband's sudden death, refused to be silent. Unlike so many widows crushed by grief and intimidation, she spoke openly of poison and treachery. Her voice, trembling yet determined, carried through church halls and market stalls. "My husband died because he would not sell his land." They smiled at our table while preparing his coffin. Others, emboldened by her courage, began confessing long-held suspicion. One planter recalled how his cousin collapsed hours after a Beaufort dinner, his estate soon transferred. Another spoke of his sister who had fallen mysteriously ill while negotiating a disputed boundary. Alone, these accounts might have been dismissed as coincidence. Together they formed a chain too heavy to ignore. Eleanor's silent witness. Through this growing storm, Eleanor remained both prisoner and pawn. At 16, her appearance reflected years of manipulation. She walked not beside Charles but beneath him, her posture bent in reluctant obedience. Servants whispered that her eyes carried a hollow brilliance, as if she lived entirely within herself, watching from behind a veil. Yet small signs suggested resistance. Lydia, the maid, recalled how Eleanor pressed a folded scrap into her hand, words hastily written, pleading, "If I do not live to see the spring, tell Dr. Fenwick. My mother's papers exist, hidden. Do not let them win." The note vanished before Lydia could deliver it, discovered and destroyed by Charles. Eleanor was punished with confinement, her chamber barred for weeks. Still, the attempt revealed her awareness of both danger and possibility. She knew evidence existed. Margaret had left it behind. Margaret's shadow. Margaret's absence haunted the mansion. Officially, she was indisposed, a polite fiction repeated by Silas whenever questioned. But servants swore no physician had been summoned, no funeral held, no grave mark. Some claimed to hear faint weeping behind locked doors. Others insisted Margaret's body had been carried out under cover of night, shrouded and silent. Her journal's half-burned pages later recovered from the ash pit suggest she had foreseen her fate. One surviving line reads, "They will silence me, but not forever. What I know will outlive me." It was this knowledge, this hidden record of crimes, that gave Eleanor hope amid captivity. The physician's warning. By mid-1838, Dr. Fenwick's private investigation became more urgent. He confronted Silas directly during a chance meeting outside St. Michael's Church. Their exchange, recorded later in Fenwick's notes, brims with quiet menace. "Fenwick, these deaths follow your shadow, too many to dismiss. Silas, you speak boldly for a man with so little evidence." Fenwick, evidence grows as does suspicion. The city watches. Silas, then let them watch. We endure. Others fall. The physician walked away convinced that confrontation would soon erupt within the Beaufort household itself. The family parlor. That eruption came one storm-lashed evening in October of 1838. Inside the parlor, heavy curtains drawn, thunder rolling beyond the windows. The Beauforts convened in tense assembly. Eleanor sat pale and rigid, Charles at her side, Silas pacing near the fireplace, Victoria arranging papers with deliberate calm. The issue at hand, Margaret's missing documents. Charles, restless and impatient, believed Eleanor knew where they were. He pressed her with threats and questions, his tone shifting from coaxing affection to open menace. "You will tell me," he hissed, gripping her wrist. "If you withhold, you betray your family. You belong to me. Your silence is treachery." Eleanor, trembling, replied only, "My mother entrusted what she knew to others. Even if I speak, you cannot stop it." Silas turned sharply, his voice low and cold. "Do not think the world will protect you, child. Without us you are nothing. With us you are safe. Choose wisely." Victoria, always the quiet manipulator, added with a veneer of sympathy, "Eleanor, this struggle is needless. Align yourself and you will inherit more than any woman in Charleston." But Eleanor, perhaps drawing strength from the memory of her mother, whispered, "I will not." The struggle, what followed, was chaos. Charles, enraged by defiance, reached for the loaded pistol resting upon the mantel. Eleanor recoiled, her chair crashing backward. Lydia, stationed nearby, screamed for help, though none came. Silas intervened, seizing Charles's arm, not to protect Eleanor but to prevent reckless exposure. "Fool," he barked. "Violence here invites discovery." Yet the struggle spun beyond control. In the melee, Eleanor slipped free, clutching a small packet she had concealed beneath her gown, fragments of her mother's notes, smuggled from Margaret's chamber weeks earlier. She fled into the storm as thunder split the night. Flight through the streets. The scene that followed remains etched in Charleston lore. Eleanor, drenched by rain, barefoot and terrified, darted through the narrow streets, the Beaufort mansion looming behind like a predator. She carried not only her mother's papers but the fragile hope of survival. Witnesses later recounted seeing a pale girl racing through the gaslit avenues, pursued by shadows. Some swore they saw Charles himself giving chase, pistol in hand, though no official record confirms it. The storm shielded her, masking her flight with rain and wind. The hidden allies. Eleanor reached the modest home of Dr. Fenwick near dawn, collapsing at his doorstep with the packet clutched to her chest. Fenwick, startled, sheltered her at once, recognizing both her peril and the weight of what she carried. The documents, though incomplete, revealed enough: names of victims, transfers of property, records of payments to corrupt officials. Fenwick realized he held the opening thread of a conspiracy far larger than rumor. He summoned Benjamin Hartwell, a courthouse clerk, whose quiet demeanor concealed a secret mission. Hartwell, long suspicious of the Beauforts, had been collecting evidence discreetly for federal contact. Together, the physician and the clerk swore to protect Eleanor and preserve her testimony. The Beauforts' fury. Back at the mansion, rage consumed the family. Silas demanded her return, Charles cursed her defiance, and Victoria devised schemes to discredit her. They spread word that Eleanor had been unwell, prone to delusions, unfit to testify. Yet whispers of her escape only fueled Charleston's suspicion. The city watched as the Beauforts tightened their defense. Servants vanished, records were burned, and the mansion became a fortress of secrecy. But for the first time, the family was not merely feared, they were doubted. Reflection. Part 5 marks the hinge of the Beaufort tragedy. The daughter who had been reshaped as wife became, through defiance and escape, the seed of the family's undoing. Her mother's shadow, preserved in hidden papers, rose from silence to speak. Charleston, once blind, now stirred awake. The storm outside the mansion had passed, but the greater storm, the storm of justice, was gathering. The winter of 1839 brought neither peace nor clarity to Charleston. Instead, it revealed the fissures that had long been concealed beneath the weight of tradition and fear. Where once the Beauforts had reigned untouchable, now their name lingered in the air with the taste of rot. Eleanor in hiding. Dr. Fenwick's home, modest but orderly, became Eleanor's sanctuary. He concealed her presence from all but two trusted allies, Benjamin Hartwell, the courthouse clerk, and Lydia, who had risked her life to guide Eleanor during her escape. Within those walls, Eleanor's days were consumed by exhaustion and dread, yet her mind, sharpened by trauma, clung to one purpose: ensuring her mother's papers reached beyond Charleston's grip. She read the surviving pages aloud to Fenwick, her voice trembling over names and dates. Thomas Wren died May 1834, following a dinner at the Beaufort home. Sarah Molyneux fell ill September 1835, estate seized by Silas Beaufort, Reverend Clay, collapsed during sermon, October 1837, signed land to Charles before death. The pattern, laid bare, resembled not chance but method. Fenwick copied each entry into his own journals, adding clinical notes: pulse irregular, symptoms consistent with tinctures of arsenic or laudanum, dosages beyond domestic accident. Hartwell, careful and deliberate, recorded the property transfers in his clerk's script. He spoke little, but his steady hand lent weight to Eleanor's trembling testimony. Charleston's unrest. Meanwhile, the city's temper shifted. Charleston society, accustomed to discreet whispers, now hummed with speculation. Taverns repeated tales of Eleanor's midnight flight. At market stalls, women debated whether Margaret Beaufort still lived, hidden behind the mansion's shuttered windows. A pamphlet circulated, anonymous but clearly informed, suggesting that the Beauforts' fortune had been built upon a harvest of grape. Though quickly suppressed, copies were read by candlelight in parlors and kitchens, sowing unease. The Beauforts responded with furious denial. Silas attended church more visibly, seating himself in the family pew with calculated solemnity. Victoria hosted small gatherings, insisting on her family's innocence, her smile unwavering though her hands trembled when she lifted her teacup. Charles, by contrast, roamed the streets with open hostility. Witnesses recalled him muttering threats, his pistol always near. His presence served less as reassurance than intimidation, as though he meant to remind Charleston that fear remained their inheritance. Federal attention. The matter might still have remained local, lost in rumor and resistance, had Hartwell not carried his records northward. In early 1839 he traveled quietly to Washington, presenting his findings to federal contacts investigating corruption in southern estates. The officials, cautious yet intrigued, saw in the Beauforts a case study in hereditary corruption, a family entwined with power, yet poisoned from within. Their interest was not merely moral but political. To expose such a dynasty could signal federal authority where state silence prevailed. Thus Charleston's dark secret began to move beyond Charleston. Margaret's final echo. In March of 1839, Lydia delivered to Fenwick a small parcel, retrieved from the Beaufort grounds, hidden in the seam of an old mattress. It contained one final page of Margaret's journal. The ink, faded but legible, bore her last confession. They speak of blood as inheritance, but ours is inheritance spoiled. If Eleanor is to live, she must unbind herself from their grasp. I have written all I dare. The rest is in her silence. The line struck Fenwick with both sorrow and resolve. Margaret had not merely chronicled crime, she had predicted its perpetuation. Her words transformed Eleanor's survival into something larger, testimony of resistance against a lineage determined to consume itself. Retaliation. But the Beauforts were not idle. Silas, sensing pressure, intensified his measures. Men loyal to the family patrolled the mansion's perimeter, shadowed Fenwick's steps, and questioned those suspected of aiding Eleanor. Several servants vanished. Whispers claimed they had been sent away, though no farewells were permitted. Charles' violence grew less restrained. One evening he cornered Lydia in a narrow street, seizing her wrist with bruising force. "Where is she?" he demanded. "You think you can hide her from me? From us?" Lydia spat in his face, earning a blow that left her bleeding, but she did not betray Eleanor. Victoria, ever the strategist, approached the matter different. She sought to manipulate public opinion, planting rumors that Eleanor had succumbed to madness. "It is a family affliction," she murmured to sympathetic ears. Her mother too was unstable. "We indulged their frailty too long." Her words, polished and deliberate, threatened to poison Eleanor's credibility even as truth emerged. The physician's record. Dr. Fenwick, anticipating such maneuvers, framed his work as medical testimony. He documented Eleanor's health with the precision of a physician, determined to secure evidence. Patient, age 16, shows signs of chronic stress, diminished appetite, pallor consistent with confinement, no indication of inherited mania or congenital disease, speech coherent, memory intact, trauma present but reasoning unimpaired. By couching her survival in clinical language, he transformed her from hysterical girl into credible witness. It was a strategy born of necessity. In a society eager to dismiss women's voices, science offered a shield. Charleston in division. By summer, Charleston stood divided. Some clung to the Beauforts' authority, unwilling to sever ties with a dynasty that had shaped their city's wealth. Others, emboldened by rumor and record, whispered that justice must come. At Michael's, a sermon denounced those who profit by the graves of neighbors. Though the Beauforts' name was not spoken, all knew the reference.
Congregants shifted uneasily, glancing toward the empty pew where Silas had once sat before retreating from public worship. Merchants debated whether to honor Beaufort credit, fearing assets might soon be seized. Servants gossiped in kitchens of voices heard in the mansion's locked rooms. Whether Margaret's ghost or Margaret herself, no one could say. The city, once bound by silence, now trembled on the brink of revelation. Eleanor's resolve. Amid this tension, Eleanor herself began to change. No longer merely a frightened child, she grew into her defiant. She insisted on reading aloud her mother's notes during Fenwick's meetings, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I was their daughter," she said once, her tone both bitter and proud. "I was forced to be his wife. Now I will be their undoing." Her transformation unsettled even her allies. Hartwell confided to Fenwick, "She bears a strength unnatural for her years. I fear what such burdens will make of her." But Fenwick, ever the physician, replied, "Trauma either breaks or hardens. In her it hardened." The mansion sealed. By autumn of 1839, the Beaufort mansion had become a citadel of secrecy. Shutters remained closed. Visitors turned away. Correspondence routed through intermediary. Neighbors spoke of strange odors drifting from its chimneys, chemical, acrid, not the scent of ordinary hearths. Some believed the family conducted experiments within, perfecting new tinctures to preserve their dominion. Others whispered that Margaret still lingered inside, a living prisoner whose silence was enforced by drugs. The truth remained locked within those walls, but outside, pressure mounted, and the walls themselves seemed to lean inward, burdened by secrets too heavy to bear. Reflection. Thus, by the close of 1839, the Beauforts found themselves encircled by suspicion, by record, by their own unraveling. Eleanor, once the most vulnerable, had become the most dangerous. Her survival was no longer personal but public, a living indictment of her family's design. The stage was set. Charleston could no longer look away. The question was no longer if the Beauforts would fall, but how violently. The year 1840 did not dawn with hope but with exposure. What had lingered in rumor now bled into record. Physicians, clerks and federal agents began piecing together the fragments Eleanor had carried out of the Beaufort house, and in that work, a grotesque portrait emerged, not merely of crime but of method. The journals unsealed, Margaret's surviving journals, once fragmented scraps, were painstakingly transcribed by Dr. Fenwick. His copies, bound in plain covers, bore the heading, "On the Manipulation of Bloodline." Within those faded lines lay the Beaufort's doctrine, an ideology at once archaic and monstrous. Margaret had recorded overheard conversations, diagrams sketched in Silas's hand, lists of tinctures prepared by Victoria. The intent was clear: to preserve the Beaufort line by any means, even at the cost of kinship, sanity, or soul. One passage, scrawled in Margaret's desperate hand, read, "They speak of her not as daughter but as vessel. She will preserve the name by binding it to its. They call this legacy, but it is ruin. The tinctures dull her will, and the prayers sanctify her chains." Here, for the first time, the horror was plain. Eleanor had been groomed not only as child but as wife. Her identity collapsed into pseudo-medical practice. What lent the case its most chilling gravity were the notes on remedies. Silas and Victoria, steeped in both superstition and outdated natural philosophy, devised a regimen of powders and draughts, intended to manage Eleanor's body and mind.
Powders of calomel, mercurous chloride administered under guise of purgation left her weak and pliable. Laudanum tinctures supplied nightly clouded her judgment, inducing obedience while fraying memory. Infusions of belladonna in smaller doses widened her pupils, a cosmetic effect mistaken by neighbors as angelic. Fenwick, reviewing these notes, remarked in his journal, "A regimen more suited to torture than cure. These are not remedies but instruments of control." It was pseudoscience twisted into ritual, medical language cloaking what was in truth possession of a body and will. Charleston's physicians divide. When Fenwick shared his transcriptions with colleagues, the response was divided. Some dismissed the account as exaggeration. Families are eccentric, women hysterical. To infer design from disorder is unwise. Others, however, recognized the pattern. Abernathy, writing privately to Fenwick, observed, "The symptoms describe pallor, tremors, incoherent speech, align with overuse of calomel and laudanum. That such substances were administered deliberately to a child is abhorrent, yet public acknowledgement remained scarce. To condemn the Beauforts was to imperil one's practice, one's standing." Silence persisted even as evidence accumulated. Federal inquiry. Meanwhile, Hartwell's federal contacts grew impatient. They requested not whispers but proof, dates, signatures, causes of death. The Beauforts, it was said, controlled Charleston. Only external authority could unseat them. Thus began the first formal inquiry. Officials arrived quietly in the spring of 1840, interviewing widows, ex-servants, and minor clerks. Their language was cautious, their presence discreet, but the Beauforts felt the pressure. Silas responded with calculation. He dispatched letters to influential allies, framing the investigation as an insult to Charleston's honor. They would unmake our sovereignty, he wrote, by accusing our most faithful family. Victoria redoubled her efforts at charm, hosting small gatherings for clergymen and magistrates, insisting upon the family's devotion. Charles, however, grew reckless, openly threatening those rumored to have spoken with officials. The house became a fortress not merely of walls but of narratives, each Beaufort laboring to control the story as fiercely as they once controlled Eleanor. Eleanor's testimony. At the heart of the inquiry stood Eleanor herself. She was summoned to speak, not in open court but in private sessions with appointed examiners. Fenwick, seated at her side, documented each answer. Her words, though halting, were clear. I was given drafts against my will. My mother spoke of plans I did not understand, only that I must obey. Charles declared me both sister and wife. I resisted. I was struck. I was locked away. The examiners, though visibly shaken, pressed for detail. Eleanor's youth lent her account both vulnerability and credibility. Here was no hardened accuser but a girl bent beneath unnatural weight. Hartwell later wrote, her testimony bore the cadence of truth, not theatrical, not convenient but reluctant, torn from wounds yet fresh. The mansion watched. In Charleston, the Beaufort mansion drew stares like a wound festering in the city's heart. Neighbors reported strange sights, windows glowing at unnatural hours, carriages arriving with curtains drawn, muffled cries carried on summer air. One account, preserved in a local diary, reads, last night, near midnight, I saw shadows moving across the upper windows as though a struggle took place, yet the house remained sealed, no servant stirring. Whether fact or invention, such stories cemented the mansion as locus of dread. Parents warned children not to wander near it. Sailors spoke of it in taverns as if it were cursed ground, and yet for all its infamy none dared enter. The Beaufort doctrine. What most disturbed investigators was the philosophical heart of the family's practice. In Silas's hand appeared treatises on the purification of blood. He cited classical sources, medieval alchemists, even biblical passages, weaving a justification for incestuous union and hereditary control. He wrote, where others dilute, we preserve. Where others falter, we endure. The child is vessel and continuity. The wife is merely daughter matured. Fenwick, upon reading this, annotated in margin, madness cloaked in scholarship, the language of legacy concealing the practice of violation. Thus the Beauforts stood revealed not merely as poisoners but as theorists of corruption, their crimes deliberate, defended by twisted reason. Growing tension. By the year's end, Charleston balanced on a knife's edge. The Beauforts still commanded wealth and allies, yet their reputation crumbled. Eleanor's testimony, Margaret's notes, and Fenwick's journals spread quietly among officials. The family responded with threats and bribes, but for the first time fear shifted sides. Where once neighbors feared the Beauforts, now the Beauforts feared exposure. Charles, unpredictable and violent, posed the greatest danger. Rumors claimed he carried pistols even in church, muttering of traitors in every pew. Victoria, her composure fraying, withdrew from society altogether. Silas alone maintained the façade, though his letters betray strain. Our fortress trembles. She, the girl, has undone years of silence. I see cracks where once was stone. Reflection. Thus 1840 revealed the anatomy of the Beaufort legacy. Not accident but design. Not tragedy but doctrine. Their practices, dressed in medical garb, were in truth rituals of control, aimed at perpetuating a name already steeped in death. The inquiry had begun. The family's fortress shook. Eleanor, once silenced, now spoke. The city waited. The nation listened. And the Beauforts, sensing collapse, prepared to defend themselves not with argument but with fury. It began not with thunder but with whispers, yet whispers that spread like contagion through Charleston's parlors and markets. By December of 1840, the Beaufort family's grip had weakened. The inquiry pressed closer, and Eleanor's testimony, though given in private, seeped outward in fragments. The community, long complicit through silence, now turned its ear toward scandal. What followed was not merely collapse but implosion. A house long fortified against scrutiny now cracking under its own monstrous weight. Margaret's revelation, the decisive blow, came from within. Margaret, thought by all to be failing under her long illness, revealed strength long concealed. One winter evening, before a gathering of family and intimates, she rose from her chair with a steadiness that startled all present. Her words, carefully measured, resounded with the clarity of a woman who had rehearsed them in silence for years. I have kept I have seen, I have heard, and I have written. The blood you thought bound us shall be your undoing. What she disclosed stunned the room. She had preserved not only notes but physical evidence, soil marked by accelerants, receipts of illicit payments, scraps of correspondence naming officials bought and bribed. More damning still were her transcriptions of family meetings, sessions where Silas and Charles plotted murders as though arranging business ventures. Her illness, she revealed, had been the mask beneath which she labored. The arsenic that weakened her had paradoxically shielded her. The family, believing her mind clouded, had not guarded their words in her presence. Thus the poisoners had created their own historian. Silas's fury. Silas's response was immediate and terrifying. His composure, so carefully maintained, fractured. Witnesses recall his face twisting with a rage not theatrical but primal. He denounced Margaret as a traitor, accusing her of madness, of conjuring slanders from fevered dreams. Yet the more he raged, the clearer it became that her words struck truth. Charles, equally enraged, moved as though to silence her by force, but Victoria intervened, perhaps from instinct, perhaps from fear of what violence in that moment would reveal. It was Eleanor who sat frozen, realization flooding her. The house that had raised her was no home but a prison, its walls papered with lies, its every kindness calculated to ensnare. The hidden archive. Margaret directed investigators to hidden compartments within the mansion, concealed spaces behind wainscoting, beneath floorboards, inside unused hearth. There they discovered ledgers cataloging decades of acquisitions, lands seized after accidents, debts settled only after convenient deaths, and payments issued to nameless men from New Orleans to Savannah. Among the papers lay one particularly grotesque item, a document written in Silas's unmistakable hand, entitled, On the Perpetuation of the Line. It detailed with chilling detachment the plan to marry Eleanor into her own adoptive line, thereby consolidating both wealth and secrecy. Fenwick, present during the search, later wrote, The evidence lay before us not as rumor but as artifact. I held in my hand the very doctrine of their corruption. Charleston reacts. When fragments of these discoveries reached Charleston streets, the city shifted from uneasy silence to outright panic. Merchants whispered that their fortunes too might have been targeted, had they risen too quickly. Widows began re-examining the deaths of their husbands with new suspicion. Servants who had long endured humiliation under the Beauforts spoke now with unrestrained bitterness. The mansion itself became a symbol of dread. Children dared one another to approach its gate. Neighbors avoided its shadow at dusk. The very name Beaufort, once spoken with reverence, now carried the weight of a curse. The inquiry intensifies. Federal agents, emboldened by Margaret's revelations, pressed harder. They summoned Silas to present himself in Charleston for questioning. His reply was defiant. He would not be judged by outsiders who know nothing of our soil, but defiance could not shield him forever. Letters preserved in the archives reveal his desperation. To one ally he wrote, They circle like carrion birds, yet I will not yield. She, the girl, remains within my grasp. She is my key still. It was clear, even as the walls closed in, Silas viewed Eleanor, not as child nor ward, but as possession, bargaining chip and vessel of legacy. The family fractures. The pressure revealed fissures long concealed. Victoria, her health faltering under constant strain, withdrew from her husband's counsel. Charles, reckless and violent, grew unpredictable. He stormed through Charleston taverns, cursing those who spoke against his family, brandishing pistols, daring any man to defy him. One account records him shouting, We built this city's wealth. Without us you'd have mud huts. Do you think you can judge me? But bravado could not disguise fear. The Beauforts, who had orchestrated so many deaths in shadows, now found themselves dragged into unwelcome light. Eleanor's realization. Amidst this collapse, Eleanor confronted the full scope of her entrapment. Every act of kindness, her schooling, her social debut, her very adoption, had been part of a design. She was never free. She was a commodity,
a vessel for the continuation of corruption. Fenwick recorded her words during one session. I see now it was all prison. They gave me books, but not truth. They gave me dresses, but not freedom. They named me daughter, then wife. I was never meant to be Her testimony, carried in trembling voice, crystallized the horror into human form. It was not abstract conspiracy, but a young woman's stolen life. The parlor confrontation. The climax of the family's unraveling came during a winter evening, when agents, accompanied by Fenwick, entered the Beaufort parlor to confront Silas directly. Margaret, frail yet resolute, insisted upon being present, her records in hand. The scene, reconstructed from multiple journals, remains one of the most chilling episodes in Charleston's history. Silas stood defiant, Charles at his side like a guard dog. Victoria wept quietly in the corner. Eleanor, pale but determined, faced the man who had raised her as both child and bride-to-be. The agents read aloud portions of Margaret's files. Silas attempted interruption, but his protests fell hollow as document after document revealed his scheme. When they reached the treatise on perpetuation of the line, Eleanor herself whispered, "You wrote this. You would have me chained forever." Silas's mask shattered. He struck the table with his hand, declaring, "Yes, you were chosen. You carry our future whether you will it or no." The room fell silent. In that instant, the truth was no longer hidden in journals or whispers. It stood exposed, confessed by its own architect. Collapse of authority. Word of the confrontation spread with astonishing speed. Though officials sought to keep details sealed, Charleston is a city of tongues. By morning, the tale had traveled from wharf to plantation. The Beauforts, once untouchable, now stood naked before their community. Allies abandoned them. Clergymen refused their pew. Merchants distanced their accounts. Even old friends, who had long enjoyed the family's patronage, found reason to stay away. The name Beaufort, so long synonymous with power, became synonymous with corruption. Reflection. Thus ended the year 1840, with the Beaufort mansion no longer a fortress but a ruin in waiting. Its secrets, once entombed, now lay scattered in journals, testimonies and public rumor. Yet even as the family fractured, a darker truth loomed. The Beauforts were not finished. For men like Silas and Charles, exposure was not defeat, but provocation. They would not go quietly. And in the shadows of Charleston, plans for retaliation already stirred. Charleston had grown accustomed to rumor, but nothing prepared it for blood. The Beauforts, stripped of their aura of invincibility, now behaved not as statesmen, but as cornered beasts. The spring of 1841 would prove their last campaign, a campaign not of subtle poisons and careful contracts, but of fire, steel and fear. Silas's final gambit. In letters later recovered, Silas confessed that he saw the inquiry, not as defeat, but as a temporary siege. He believed if he could silence key witnesses and frighten the city into paralysis, he might yet reclaim authority. Charleston is weak, he wrote. Its people thrive only under a hand firm enough to bind them. Should we fall, the city will rot. It must be reminded who its masters. His plan was simple in outline, brutal in execution. Remove Margaret, before she could testify publicly, and reclaim Eleanor, who remained the linchpin of both legacy and inheritance. The night of night.
The attempt came on a moonless night in March. Margaret, increasingly frail but still guarded by agents, was roused from her chamber by the sound of splintering wood. Two masked men, later identified as Charles Beaufort and a hired hand, forced their way inside. Margaret, expecting death, clutched her journal to her chest. Yet fate intervened. Eleanor, who had taken to sleeping near her guardian, intercepted them. Standing between her aunt and the intruders, she demanded to know if all the whispers were true. Charles, in his fury, tore away his mask, declaring, "Truth? The truth is blood, girl. It is all you are, all you will ever be. You will come with us, or you will die with her." What followed was chaos. Agents burst into the chamber, pistols drawn. Shots were fired, wood splintered, glass shattered. Charles escaped into the night, wounded but alive. His accomplice was not so fortunate. His body was found sprawled upon the stair, a pistol ball lodged in his chest. The Beauforts had declared war not with contracts or whispers but with bullets. Charleston in terror. By dawn, Charleston awoke to terror. If the Beauforts could storm a guarded home in the heart of the city, what safety remained for anyone? Merchants boarded windows, households armed themselves, and rumors of a broader uprising spread like fire. Fenwick recorded, "The city quaked, not from earthquake nor storm, but from the knowledge that its old tyrants, though unmasked, yet lived and would take vengeance before surrender. The Beaufort mansion, already shunned, now stood like a fortress under siege. Locals reported lights burning all night, shadows pacing the upper floors, and the sound of hammering as barricades were raised within. Victoria's breaking. Amid this descent into violence, Victoria Beaufort withered. Long the silent accomplice, she now found herself consumed by guilt. Neighbors recalled seeing her at St. Philip's Church, kneeling alone for hours, her frame trembling. She no longer defended Silas, nor Charles, but neither could she summon the strength to betray them. A journal fragment suggests she attempted to send warning to Margaret and Eleanor. In a letter never delivered, she wrote, "Do not trust the walls. They mean to take her, to bind her. I cannot save you, but perhaps God may." Her health declined rapidly. By May she was bedridden, her once commanding presence reduced to a whisper. Yet her death, when it came, bore no peace. Some whispered that Silas himself hastened her end, viewing her weakness as liability. The mansion burns. The most dramatic episode occurred in late April, when Charleston awoke to see flames licking the sky above Meeting Street. The Beaufort mansion, symbol of their dynasty, had caught fire. Whether accident or design remains disputed. Some claimed Charles, in drunken rage, had overturned a lantern. Others insisted Silas, cornered by warrants, had ordered the blaze himself, hoping to destroy incriminating records. Whatever the cause, the inferno consumed more than timber. Witnesses described the night as apocalyptic, shutters bursting outward in fiery plumes, smoke rolling across the rooftops, the air filled with the screams of livestock trapped in the stables. Crowds gathered, but few dared assist. The Beauforts had sowed too much hatred. Their cries went unanswered. When the flames subsided, the mansion stood gutted, its grandeur reduced to blackened stone. But within the ruins, investigators found not ashes alone. They recovered scorched yet legible pages of Margaret's secret archive, proof surviving even the fire meant to erase it. Eleanor's stand. Through it all, Eleanor refused to be reclaimed. On the night of the fire, she stood alongside Margaret, her face illuminated by the burning house that had once imprisoned her. Witnesses recalled her words, "Let it burn, let them see what remains when lies are consumed." Her transformation was complete. No longer the uncertain ward, she had become the chief accuser, the living embodiment of the family's crimes, and the proof of its corruption. Fenwick noted. Her voice, once subdued, rang with command. She was no longer the daughter, no longer the bride-to-be, but a woman forged in ruin. Silas's desperation. The patriarch, however, refused to yield. With his mansion gone and his wife near death, he retreated into the countryside, seeking allies among old business partners and rural families, who still owed him debts. But the tide had turned. Letters were returned unopened, doors barred, hands that once took his gold now clenched against him. In one desperate missive, Silas wrote, "They scurry from me like rats from flame. Do they not recall who I am? I made them, I fed them, and still I will not fall." Yet fall he did. By June, federal agents had tracked him to a plantation outside Georgetown. What followed would mark the bloody climax of the Beaufort saga. The capture of Charles. Charles, meanwhile, could not hide his recklessness. He haunted Charleston taverns, issuing drunken threats, swearing vengeance against Margaret and Eleanor. It was there, in a waterfront inn, that authorities finally seized him. After a violent struggle, he was dragged through the streets, cursing, spitting, declaring, "You fools think you are free. We are in your blood. We are your city." His arrest sent waves through Charleston. The beast had been chained, but the patriarch still roamed free. The gathering storm. As spring turned to summer, all eyes fixed upon Silas. Rumors abounded, that he plotted escape to Europe, that he had caches of gold buried along the Carolina coast, that he had sworn blood oaths with secret societies. Each rumor only heightened the dread. Margaret, near the end of her strength, pressed Fenwick to ensure the truth was preserved even if Silas eluded capture. "Do not let him vanish into myth," she implored. "Name him, bind him to the page, so the city never forgets what it endured." Reflection. Thus stood Charleston in mid-1841, a city scarred by fire, shaken by attempted murder, its most powerful dynasty broken, but not yet extinguished. The Beaufort name was ash, yet its patriarch still breathed, still plotted, still threatened. All awaited the final reckoning, the confrontation that would determine not only the fate of Silas Beaufort, but the legacy of a city long poisoned by his shadow. And in that reckoning,
Eleanor would stand at the center, no longer child, no longer pawn, but the living witness whose testimony would close the book on the house that had stolen her life. By the autumn of 1841, Charleston no longer trembled in whispers, but in open anticipation. The Beaufort name, once a crown upon the city's brow, had become a curse spat in taverns and murmured in prayer. Silas Beaufort, patriarch of a dynasty built upon deception, stood as the last defiant shadow. His son Charles was shackled, his mansion burned, his wife entombed in grief and illness. Yet Silas himself remained, unbroken, his final days more dangerous than all the years of quiet tyranny that preceded them. The fall of the patriarch. He was captured in August. Witnesses spoke of a farmhouse near Georgetown where the air reeked of damp straw and mold, the shutters nailed against intrusion. When agents stormed the structure, they found Silas, seated at a table, a pistol before him, and a scattering of papers, half-burned letters, genealogies, receipts of debt. He had shaved his beard and cut his hair close, as if altering his appearance might alter the fate barreling toward him. He did not resist. Instead he smiled with lips parched and eyes burning, declaring, "I do not kneel to men, only to God," and he is silent. The pistol, curiously, bore no powder in its pan. Whether he had lost the nerve to use it, or had never intended to, remains unknown. Escorted in chains back to Charleston, Silas became a spectacle. Crowds thronged the streets, hurling curses, rotten vegetables, even stones at his carriage. Children pointed as if watching some dreadful carnival. Where once he had inspired awe, he now drew only hatred. The trial. His trial began in September, conducted in the Charleston courthouse under the gaze of hundreds. The charges were many: conspiracy to murder, coercion, unlawful confinement, fraud, and a litany of abuses that spilled across 2 decades. Yet the trial was not merely legal, it was ritual, a purging of memory and guilt. Margaret, though pale as death, took the stand. Supported by Eleanor, she recounted with trembling voice the years of fear, the attempted poisoning, the night of knives when Charles burst into her chamber. She read passages from her journals, her handwriting wavering, but indelible. Then came Eleanor herself, no longer the frightened ward. She faced Silas with composure that astonished the city. Her testimony cut sharper than any blade. The enforced betrothal, the truth of her parentage, the slow erosion of her childhood. When Silas sneered, she did not falter. Instead, she met his gaze and declared, "You told me I was born for you. I was not. I was born in spite of you." The words echoed through the hall, carried on whispers for weeks after. The sentence. The jury deliberated less than an hour. Silas Beaufort was sentenced to hang. The date fixed was October. It was not merely justice, but spectacle, an execution the city demanded as balm for its wounds. Charles too was condemned, his crimes compounded by the attempted murder of Margaret, and the assault on Eleanor. Their fates would intertwine at the gala. The execution. The morning of October 2 was clear, the air sharp with autumn's first bite. Crowds gathered on the green long before dawn, pressing so tightly that soldiers were forced to line the perimeter with bayonets. Merchants sold cider, children perched upon their fathers' shoulders, and preachers intoned that justice was finally upon them. At 10 o'clock, Silas and Charles were brought forth. The elder strode with an unnatural calm, his chains clinking like grim music. Charles raged, spitting curses, his wrists raw from struggle. The gallows loomed high against the pale sky. As they mounted the scaffold, the murmurs swelled. Silas asked leave to speak. Granted, he turned not to the crowd but to Eleanor, standing at the forefront with Margaret beside her. "Blood remembers," he said, his voice carrying like a sermon. "You may curse my name, but you cannot scour it from yourself. You are Beaufort, child, and Beaufort you shall remain." Eleanor did not reply. She simply bowed her head, lips moving in prayer, refusing to grant him the triumph of her fear. At the signal, the nooses were drawn tight. Charles screamed, thrashing. Silas only closed his eyes. The trapdoor fell. Thus ended the house of Beaufort. The aftermath. Charleston exhaled, yet uneasily. Justice had been served, but scars do not vanish with the stroke of rope. For weeks, citizens spoke of strange dreams, of fire licking at shutters, of footsteps upon staircases, of children calling out in voices not their own. The Beaufort mansion, though gutted, became a site of pilgrimage. Strangers wandered its blackened halls, swearing they heard sobs in the night or smelled the acrid tang of arsenic. The city debated demolishing it entirely, yet some argued it should stand, a ruin to remind future generations of what unchecked power could wreak. Margaret lived only a few months longer, her body spent, though her papers carefully catalogued by Fenwick ensured her testimony endured. Eleanor, though offered shelter by sympathetic families, vanished from the records soon after. Some claimed she fled north, seeking anonymity. Others swore they glimpsed her near the ruins late at night, as if unable to sever herself from the place that had defined and destroyed her. The whispered legacy. Fenwick, in his closing notes, warned against forgetting. Evil does not perish with its authors. It lingers in walls, in whispers, in the marrow of those who survive. Charleston may rebuild, but it will rebuild upon bone. Even now, more than a century later, stories persist. Some speak of a young woman's figure seen pacing near the old Beaufort grounds, her face pale, her eyes shadowed, her lips moving as if reciting testimony only the dead can hear. Others insist they feel a pressure in the air when passing that quarter of Meeting Street, as though the city itself still remembers the tyranny it endured. Perhaps Eleanor's words proved most prophetic. I was born in spite of you. For in her survival, however fleeting, there lies both defiance and warning. Thus ended the tale of the Beauforts, a dynasty that consumed itself, a family bound by blood yet undone by its corruption. From whispers of poison to fire and gallows, they charted their own ruin. And yet ruin does not rest. Charleston bears their shadows still. If you walk near Meeting Street after dark, listen carefully. Some say you will hear chains dragging across cobblestones, or a voice low measured, commanding, murmuring, "Blood, remember." And if you hear it, do not turn, because the Beauforts are not entirely gone.